We're on air, so I think we've started. Welcome, everyone. We have a great panel in front of us today, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking today about organizations that have been radically changing the approaches to supporting access to decent homes in their work across the globe. And they'll be talking about applying market systems development approaches to housing. I think long-term systemic change, I think high impact and impact at scale by working with local and international market actors, often private sector firms and individual private sector actors that are doing much of this work. We are going to be hearing from panelists based in Peru, based in Turkey, based in the USA. I'm coming to you from Cape Town, South Africa. And so to start off, let's explore why are organizations doing this? Why is it important? And what are they doing? So let me turn first of all to our colleague, Jennifer Weatherall. Jennifer is the technical advisor for cash and markets at Catholic Relief Services. And Jennifer, over to you on what are some of the things that you're really focusing on as an organization, why market systems approaches to what you're doing. I'm going to ask the panelists to mute themselves if they're not speaking. And Jennifer, I am going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And it's so nice to be with you all today. So in terms of why change at CRS to apply market systems approaches to housing, I'll talk about three of the main reasons why this is kind of important to us. So the first is related to how we can extend our impact and achieve scale in our programming. So CRS is primarily a humanitarian organization, though we do work in recovery and development. And last year in 2020, there were more than 80 million people displaced from their homes worldwide, with over 98 million people affected as a result of various emergencies, protracted crisis, and the impact of climate change. So that traditionally our focus is on low income and the most vulnerable segments of a society that are impacted by crisis. So with climate change, conflict and other disasters, we're expecting the number of people impacted by such emergencies and therefore the number of people in need of housing solutions to only increase. And with our direct implementation approaches, where we provide financial, social, technical support to individual households to be able to recover, rebuild or repair their homes, we're committed to ensuring safe and dignified homes for just a fraction of these people, 1.5 million people by 2030 is our agency strategy. So recognizing that we have resources and housing is one of the most costly investments, how can we use our resources more effectively to have wider impact and achieve change at scale? And that's really resulted in CRS establishing a kind of strategic change platform, we're calling it, that outlines a goal of reaching an additional 8.5 million people through influencing and scale. And this is primarily through influencing for systems change, either with government, our peer organizations, and the wider humanitarian system, and importantly, through market systems. So our entry point for considering market systems development more systematically in our housing work has really been this organizational focus on scale. And so far, our experience has been much more on influencing government and peer organizations. But we know that we can't look at that in isolation. And we also know that millions of low-income families around the world, they get their housing through market systems. So if those market systems were to be more inclusive and efficient, would more vulnerable families get access to safe and dignified housing? This is really the nut that we're trying to crack within CRS. And we're really at the beginning of this journey on applying market systems approaches to housing and looking at how we can learn from our development colleagues to adapt approaches to humanitarian and recovery settings with a view to building resilience for when the next crisis happens. So that takes me to the second reason why this is an important area for us, which is really to contribute to building resilience. So following an emergency, we usually focus on using markets to meet people's immediate needs. You know, we might buy materials from local markets for people to rebuild their homes, or we might give people cash assistance so that they can buy the materials, hire labor that they need. And then in recovery, we might look at supporting market recovery, so giving grants to traders so that they can rebuild their warehouses and restart their operations, while also encouraging some behavior change and supporting building back better approaches at the household level. But this is usually where we stop in our humanitarian work. But if we can encourage more sustainable behavior change among households, if we can support market actors to introduce or improve the products and services, you know, that might be more resilient, or help low-income households access these products and services, then hopefully when the next crisis happens, fewer houses will be impacted and the market will be better able to respond to the recovery needs of households. And ideally, market systems will be more resilient for the next crisis. And we really see crisis as a disruptor, and therefore, you know, it can create an entry point for us to find new ways of working with market actors, and finding kind of new solutions to strengthen market systems. So maybe just as a quick example from India, we worked with vendors to introduce more disaster resilient construction designs for houses in areas prone to cyclones. And this included working with vendors to develop an improved design of concrete pillar and an improved anchor to connect. So that introduced more stable and durable buildings that would better withstand the impact of, you know, strong winds and cyclones in future. And then finally, just to wrap up, the third reason why we're looking at market systems approaches is really because of the integral role that markets play in enabling low-income households to access housing, particularly after an emergency. So our experience in India, as I mentioned, has really demonstrated that although there can be widespread, you know, government initiatives to provide financial support to households to rebuild, repair, or improve their housing, these households are relying on markets to access what they need for this. So in India, part of why we came up with the concrete pillar design improvements was that our team really looked at what the government was providing in terms of financial support and what low-income households could actually access with that amount. So not just considering, you know, availability of items, but also quality, design, behaviors, and practices. And then they came up with a design that was affordable and identified what needed to change in the market system, you know, having certain products available to make this accessible to households. I'll hand over back to you, Margie.
Great. And Jennifer, I really appreciated your focus on building communities' ability through the local private sector and which kind of products can be available and how those are adapted for a lot of the shocks and stresses that communities are focusing, so that you're not only trying to solve the housing problem and challenge now, but are looking at how the community themselves, especially through the private sector, can be more prepared and focused, probably more resilient in the future in terms of combating some of these challenges and having the right products, the right know-how, distribution channels ready, set up, ways to promote these to the target market, really interesting strategies there. And thank you for that example from India, a very tangible example of how that has been done differently. Let's move to one of our panelists, Sheldon Yoder, who's calling in from the United States. Sheldon is Senior Technical Advisor for Applied Innovation at Habitat for Humanity International. Sheldon, can you talk a little bit about why is this type of focus on market systems important for you as an organization, and what are some of the shifts that you've made, how you did do work, and what does this mean for your programming now?
Yeah, thanks, Margie. In terms of why we do this work, Habitat has a vision. Our vision is a world where everyone has a decent place to live. And 1.6 billion is one of the most cited numbers for families who don't have, or individuals who don't have a decent place to live globally. So there's clearly a massive need. And to ensure that our ambitions actually match the scale of the problem, we've had to think outside of the box and explore more systemic approach that offer the potential to make a significant dent in that number. So the underlying motivation for all of this is the desire for significant impact at scale. And we know that most low-income people already use the market to put a roof over their heads. Ultimately, this is not about solving the problem of affordable housing now, but about ensuring that the market is part of the solution going forward. Perhaps the easiest way to talk about what we are doing is, like you mentioned, discuss those shifts or the aha moments we've had in the last few years, which have really changed how we work. Working in systems means that we need to recognize that we cannot impose durable change from the outside. It has to come from inside, from actors within the system. And this has led to one of our biggest ahas in the last while, that we need to be partnering with behaviors primarily, and the actual firms and other stakeholders secondarily. Or put another way, we're partnering with firms to exhibit the behaviors that we want to see in the market, to influence others to also exhibit these behaviors. An example of that may help explain this concept. In Mexico, we have identified one of the most significant challenges is the lack of design and architectural services for low-income home builders. So it would be tempting to think first in terms of who the biggest players are in the market, who could maybe develop some new platform that could provide cheap design services to families or something of that sort. But that's also an example of change imposed from the outside, as well as starting with the firm instead of the behavior. So instead, we've looked for examples where the market is already providing these services, which led us to an enterprising architect who has indeed figured out how to provide design services to low-income families. Now, his firm might not be an appealing partner from a size perspective, but we are seeing the right behaviors, and the households themselves are responding positively, paying for these services. So what we are trying to do is find ways to amplify these behaviors, to amplify the work of this firm. So with our support, one of the things that he has done is begun teaching classes at the leading architectural school in Mexico, teaching the next generation of architectural students. So by partnering with this behavior, we are hoping that we can find outsized impact, not by copying his business per se, but by harvesting learnings and expanding his influence in the system, influencing others to do the same or similar things with ripple effects that can spread throughout the system.
It's interesting, Sheldon, as you're speaking, I think one of the things I appreciate is you'll start by looking at what is lacking in the market system right now. What is the kind of behavior you want to see in terms of what people value, what services they'll pay for, what kind of services are available in the market, and starting with that perspective and seeing how do you start looking at where something is working and then how to amplify that so that other market actors, firms, other individuals start taking on these behaviors and start changing what people are investing in, what is being provided in different ways. I'm really interested for the audience today to understand what happens in terms of analysis. There must be some understanding of what is happening, what is lacking, and then what the uptake is. Is that something you've thought about, and how has that changed for you as an organization?
Yes, that's actually one of the most important, learnings on more systemic programming, and certainly has been a big aha for us, is around that analysis process that always starts these types of programs. I mean, we know that the housing systems we work in are complex, so the pitfall is to get lost in that analysis paralysis. I'm remembering one of our first market analyses involved well over 100 one-on-one interviews that we did in about 6 weeks, which was a massive level of effort, but not necessarily a corresponding level of insight. We now understand that we need a basic level of understanding to get started, for sure, but we've learned to not spend lots of time and effort on those massive scoping studies. Instead, we start with a quick summary research and then supplement this with cheap, simple interventions and experiments that try to solve problems that we've identified. One example in the Philippines that comes to mind is our summary research identified the challenge of families not building with proper foundations, which is a real issue in a country as disaster prone as the Philippines. But instead of more research, we decided to hold a few community events that we called build fairs, where we mixed entertainment and education for both families and the laborers, the masons, the artisans that were building the homes. We also distributed a simple guide for building in the right sequence, and then used the feedback we got from the families at those events to continue tailoring that guide and developing strategies for getting this information into more families' hands. So that's one example. Another example, in the Philippines, again, we recently held a global crowdsourcing initiative to ask for the best solutions on cheaply retrofitting foundations to make them disaster resilient. And we received many high quality ideas and have selected one solution that ticks all of our boxes. It's cheap, effective, liked by the households. And the actual kind of crowdsourcing initiative was not that expensive in time and money. So it's a fairly low effort way to get more insight and find solutions.
Thanks, Sheldon. I really also hear what you're saying in terms of not spending a huge amount of time and resources up front for analysis, which probably quickly gets out of date as the market system is changing, but keeping kind of the analysis going throughout, and also working with private sector firms in the marketplace, small and large, to themselves learn how to continually test what is happening, to hear what the market is saying, and kind of have it not only be the program doing it, but working through the market actors to build that competency. So really helpful. I wanted to move for a minute to another panelist. Gemma is joining us from Peru. Gemma Stratico is the country lead for the Terra Center for Innovation in Shelter, also with Habitat for Humanity. We're really interested in the what is different? What are you doing here? Could you share with us some examples in terms of what does this market systems development approach look like on the ground? Over to you, Gemma.
Thank you, Margie. And I will try to share a little bit about how we moved away from analysis paralysis to fail-fast prototypes. And that has been a learning curve for us in also to explore the role of market players and how we can understand by the work that we do how things could work different and how we can amplify certain behaviors. And I would like to talk about what we have learned in the adoption of building technologies for how to get these innovative materials and services to households. In the past, and maybe a few years ago, we tested introducing construction technologies directly to homeowners, and that didn't work. It didn't work because homeowners handle many risks with little information and do not use innovative or sustainable materials in the way they build. They are adverse to any risk that could jeopardize their housing investments. So we asked ourselves the question, how is best to introduce building technologies in the housing value chain? And why is this important? It is important because building technologies can reduce time and cost for construction in the affordable housing sector while promoting green, sustainable construction. But many times in doing so, we fail horribly. And just for a little context, we are talking about families that build their homes introducing financing, infrastructure, building materials in slow and very expensive stages. And those stages of incremental buildings can take 30 years in Peru. So we studied the customer's journey of different archetypes of families in the low-income sector and realized there that there is an opportunity where we can ramp up the time of building construction. And this is the government subsidy program. Government subsidy programs, when they start and enter the low-income segment, is a great leap forward for this process of incremental building. And we studied how the family that receives government subsidy homes the next day, it's in negotiations with the local mason of how to build the second story, the third story. And those builds are being done informally with poor materials, without any blueprint, and that's a lost opportunity. So in understanding all of these scenarios, we found a chain of missed opportunities where masons, construction SMEs, that are the ones that build the government subsidy homes, and construction material providers of innovative building technologies could come in to provide added value to the families with construction products and services to build quality homes. So we are currently exploring how they can become partners to promote this for families. And if I'm able to only show one slide, I would like to show a slide of one construction material provider. It's a bricks construction material provider. And as you can see in the picture, these bricks are the size of 3 bricks. What does this mean? The mason can build their home faster. Instead of 1.5 days, a government subsidy home can be built in less time. And what does this mean for the mason and the construction SME? They can have more margins because they can build and attend homeowners in less time. And this is why they will incorporate the building technologies. On the other hand, the construction materials supplier is building training on site to apply these technologies. And not only that, they're adjusting their products. The size of the brick will now, in this micropilot, this was the first micropilot with the brick company. Now they're adjusting the size of the brick so that the mason doesn't have to cut it anymore, so that it will get the government subsidy home built faster. And what happens after that? Now the construction material provider has a distribution challenge in the community because families want to build with this new brick now. First, they were adverse to risk, saying, I don't want to try these new things. But when the mason says, let's do it, let's try it because it's a good technology, they go ahead and use it. And this is how the market players are trying to come together. They are demonstrating commercial viability, profitability, and most important, they are adjusting the mass retail strategy to reach these market segments.
I appreciate the focus on what are the retail strategies. So you're working through the retailers, kind of playing a behind the scenes role on how do they impact and change their distribution strategies, their promotion strategies, so that customers feel more familiar with and comfortable in trying something new. And very interesting strategies you pointed out there regarding working through service providers. So who are the service providers impacting this, where you know that the uptake of new technologies, new ways of doing things are going to be much more effective when there's specialized training and specialized support from service providers. So building that SME service provider industry seems to have significant high impact in that space.
We're enabling the entry of products and services at the same time from different market players of how they can come together in doing so to add value to the end customer.
Products, the services, and the provider of the private sector, small and large, in bringing those together. Very interesting strategies being discussed here. Let's hear from Cecilia Rivera. She's the country director in Peru at an organization called Swiss Contact. And we're very interested, Cecilia, to hear a little bit about how are you working with local stakeholders, the various market actors. Who are some of these market actors in the private sector and even those supporting them? And what is being done to kind of bring them together and move this forward? Cecilia, over to you.
Thank you, Margie. Thank you very much for the space. Well, let me tell you, Margie, I would like to tell about how inclusive market approach is applicable not only when designing and planning new interventions, but also to revise what we are doing. And allow me to start from a successful experience conducted in Colombia. There, thanks to Hilti Foundation support, we were able to tackle one of the most significant issues related to progressive construction. And this is the lack of competencies of master builders responsible for building, refurbishing, extending dwellings in the lower economic strata. And this, as mentioned by Gemma, with not technical support. These bottlenecks was addressed through the development of very well-designed training offer. By applying a systemic approach, we ensured that market actors adopted and adapted the training we helped to develop, helping them to establish linkages between training institutions and the private companies because private companies usually are the ones who pay for these trainings. And the result was very successful. More than 40,000 construction workers were trained. The players adopted the training and methodologies, and actually a very significant impact was achieved. But when the project came to its end, I would say together with our donor, with Hilti Foundation, we thought, hey, this has been a very successful experience, but it is addressing only one of many dimensions behind the informal construction challenges. And if we want to improve impact, we need to have a broader perspective. But how? So we first recognized that there are different entities seek to address the main challenges around informal and unsafe housing in the region. Lots of very interesting and effective interventions are happening right now. However, there are bound to be overlaps and unaddressed aspects. So this is why, with the impulse of an active role of Hilti Foundation again, we made an initial bet. Would a group of high-level expert entities be willing to sit together and to take a step back and to revise the whole market system, rethinking perhaps why and how we are doing things as we do? Would this give us a broader and holistic perspective? So with this in mind, we contacted entities covering different dimensions of informal construction ecosystem. Entities with a long track record and that tend to reach several countries in the region. Some of them are here with us as Habitat for Humanity, but also UN Habitat, Cities Alliance, Miyamoto International, Techo, Build-Change, among others. And in short, what we proposed was to leave for a moment what we know in terms of solutions and rethink the problems and the real root causes of the bottlenecks related to progressive housing. And through a one-year workshop series, which will end around April next year, and including also a very interesting case study in Colombia, we start this task. We look forward to ending up with innovative solutions, not necessarily new ones, but perhaps validating about what we are currently doing and with an holistic approach, but not until completing in deep the inclusive market analysis we are conducting. And it is interesting to see that when going through the analysis, we all, and I mean all, tend to jump back to the solutions very fast, bringing to the table what we are already doing, making it difficult sometimes to delve into the root causes. However, as we deepen the analysis, first examples have emerged. And in light to the reflections we have achieved. And I can give you a very short example. Let's think about the bottleneck of limited capacities for workers I was talking about before. These workers are unable to adequately plan and execute building interventions. One of the causes is for sure that there is no access to proper training for this specific target group. So as we did in Colombia, many of us have worked towards the capacity development of training providers, transfer methodologies, transfer contents. However, when going back to the whys, we see that the challenge is much more profound. Why do we find a limited interest in training entities to serve this sector or this group? Is it that they are not aware enough of the importance and dimension of this ecosystem? It may be, but there is a deep cause behind that perception. And it's that progressive construction is understood only as a matter of informality, not considering its social and its economic importance. And more relevant, not considering that it's a structural behavior, this connection between workers and families. So many training institutions want to avoid being considered a promoter of informality, and they avoid training master builders to work on their own, despite knowing that this is how the market works. So following this example, this reflection leads us to go beyond transferring methodologies into the realm of policy dialogue about the topic.
There's so many interesting things that you raised for us there, and I think some of your messaging links back Jennifer spoke about in the beginning too, which is working with stakeholders so that they themselves can come together. You're kind of acting as a background facilitator, but that the local stakeholders, often private sector, you mentioned government too, can come together and try and plan for the future. What are things that together they can solve? So that you've got a better infrastructure, distribution system, products and services flowing, and a deeper understanding of the systemic problem at hand. So that as future shocks and future challenges arise, the system itself is already got a structure where there's quick communication, there's cooperation existing, they can come together again when there's another challenge to solve, and on an ongoing basis. Very interesting there. And also your comment about the training and, you know, doing training traditionally through service providers, but also how does the private sector play a role there? That's part of their business model, is providing information and capacity building to end customers in this particular market as part of what they're doing. I wanted to circle back, Jennifer, for a moment. You were talking a little bit about how some of these approaches have changed what you're doing. Can you talk a little bit more about some examples of what has actually changed for you as an organization?
Yeah, sure. So I guess there's two main things that are maybe different about these approaches to how our usual ways of doing business. So the first is this shift, as you mentioned, around like playing more of a facilitation role rather than direct implementation. So instead of directly providing, you know, cash or materials to people whose homes might have been damaged because of a flood or an earthquake to be able to repair, you know, we're shifting to more kind of systems change and a facilitation role. So one example of this is that following the Nepal earthquake in 2015, a significant need for a change in strategy. So more than 800,000 homes and buildings needed to be rebuilt. And with the resources available, any direct support we were going to provide, you know, to individual households as an organization would have just been a drop in the ocean compared with the need. And we know that humanitarian assistance is also a tiny component of the overall recovery efforts. So we made, as an organization, the strategic decision to look at how we could engage more with government and other actors to have a wider impact. So this meant we collaborated to develop a platform to coordinate the social and technical support that was provided by the government and other actors to households that were self-recovering and rebuilding their homes, you know, without external resources from, you know, CRS or other humanitarian organizations. Or that we're using government grants to rebuild. So we worked together to develop a package of social and technical assistance that promoted good construction practices, standard designs, with principles of building back safer and better. And so instead of us directly supporting a few thousand households, we were able to kind of collaborate, influence government and others to improve the recovery process for many more. And then I think the second thing that is a bit different for us about this approach is that previously we've focused mostly on government collaboration to achieve broader impact and scale. So I think Cecilia mentioned examples where they moved to influencing, you know, policy, but we as an organization have probably been missing an opportunity to engage more with market actors strategically to achieve more inclusive market systems. It kind of requires both, you know, government and market engagement to have wider systems change. So although in many places we work, the government might be providing, you know, large scale support in the form of financial subsidies or you know, cash assistance or loans for people to rebuild their homes following a disaster. We also need to be more aware and engage more proactively with the housing market system. You know, what materials are people purchasing when they repair their homes? Where, with what type of labor and construction techniques? What information do people have access to in order to, you know, reconstruct in a way that reduces the impact of future disasters? And are the materials needed, the labor needed for reconstruction, is that affordable for our target group of, you know, low income and disaster affected families? And we know that there's numerous market systems that are involved. that need to function well for households to be able to afford to rebuild their homes effectively. You know, we've talked about materials, labor, information, financial services. The rental market is often a solution for households, especially if we think of displacement contexts. So we really, need to identify what the bottlenecks and barriers are within these market systems to enable more households to have access to safe and dignified and affordable housing, not just following this emergency, but also in the future. And government and market system strands really need to work in parallel. Yeah.
Jennifer, really useful and really interesting thinking about how much of your work was maybe more government orientated, and now you're bringing in also the private sector in different ways and working to look at how to motivate the private sector to be investing in different ways that make business sense for them, but is reaching a whole different market sector that maybe has been underserved, and how to do that most effectively in a way that has this long-term win-win. I want to turn back to Sheldon Yoder for a second. Sheldon, you spoke a little bit about kind of the testing, testing if things are working and see how the market's responding. Can you just talk a little bit about what your thoughts are in that process, and who are some of the market actors that you're working with as you do so?
Yeah, so it's very true that the testing is a big part of our work, and I think in systems change programming you hear a lot of words like trial and error, fail fast. Because it is a learning process. And one of the kind of big challenges, the trials and errors, I guess, that we've gone through is how to focus in on the market, how to think about the market, and who to partner with. So in our early phases, I think we really went high level. We stayed at the market level, and it was really difficult to zoom in and be specific. And so in our next iteration, we went extremely micro, and we're focusing on specific products and services. And that also presented problems. It was easier to zoom in and zoom out. But at the end of the day, we kind of got lost in the details. So we have really pulled back a bit, not all the way back, and have gone to a more meso level, where we are looking at industries and clusters, and most importantly, the critical functions in the market, which our change wheel here will show. There's some critical systems that we have identified, and within each of those systems, there are functions that we think are important to look at. And going back to the example I shared from Kenya, where we're working with actually another example comes from Kenya, where we really wanted to look at the kind of platforms that are providing services to consumers, as well as the media, because we knew that was a big function or functions that were either absent or not working in the way they should. And so we hired a technology firm who provides educational content via SMS. We wanted to test the appetite for home building, consumer education content with their database of subscribers. It didn't cost us much, but we found out that it had the highest engagement rate of any education campaign that our provider had ever had up to that time. And it really helped us to focus on that platforms, that services for consumers function in the change wheel that we're highlighting here. And this eventually led us to the media sector, where we've now worked on 2 edutainment programs on national television that have reached thousands, if not millions, of viewers. So that kind of way of looking at the market has been very helpful, not staying too high level, not getting too focused, but trying to find just the right level at which to view the market.
And Sheldon, thank you. And interesting that sort of housing systems change wheel that you put up, sort of bringing in why and how you'd work with different market actors in different ways. I mean, it seemed that there was sort of land and tenure and rights and transport infrastructure, public zoning, utility services, through to what you spoke about, the media, the judicial, the academic and research, just bringing together so many parts of what makes up the housing system and the various market actors, and who to work with and focus in that space. Very interesting component to think about, how do you work with these expert institutions in different ways? Cecilia, any quick insights from your work in the area of the world that you're focusing on?
Yes, and I see now a very nice connection with what Sheldon was talking about. From our experience with this workshop series, all the organizations that have joined us have in common their long-standing expertise in affordable housing and progressive construction and informal origin neighborhoods and public policies. But not all of them are familiar with the inclusive system approach, through which we have now analyzed, as mentioned before, what we are doing. So in this challenge, we were lucky to have Habitat for Humanity in the table. They, of course, are experts in the topic and in the methodologies, and they allow us to use and to adopt the change wheel that Sheldon has just mentioned. And it has helped us a lot to better understand and to better organize, especially all these actors around the table. And so and also it was very good for us to have among these partners, these participants, the combination of practitioners, some working at the micro level, others at the higher levels. And all thinking together around this change wheel has helped a lot. And just one last point, because I have talked a lot about the holistic approach, and it can be understood as if we want to do everything, and it's not, of course, the case. It doesn't mean that we expect to intervene in all the dimensions of the system, but we need to start from a comprehensive understanding of the system, the actors, the incentives, even if we then, of course, focus on specific solutions. But when doing that, we need to know what is happening around, what other dimensions of the system are addressed, and how and who is doing this. And we need to be sure that all the gaps needed are covered. So yes, I appreciate a lot the use of this change wheel.
Cecilia, it's very interesting. As you were sharing there, I was thinking that, it's almost understanding the system and the system as it is changing. We often think of a market system as kind of a flock of birds flying, and different birds are leading others at different times, and there are different influences in that space. Or I suppose even like a droplet of water falling into a pond, and each droplet has a ripple effect that changes some of the other droplets, and they can also make the change bigger or cancel them out. And I suppose a lot of part of what I'm hearing the panel speak about today is continually watching how is that changing, which market actors are leading, how do you slowly from behind, I suppose, facilitate that some of those are influencing others to invest in different ways, to promote in different ways, to be continually looking at what is needed in the local environment to make them more resilient in terms of housing and the construction industry as certain sectors move forward. So I wanted to now ask our panel to just reflect for a moment. What is something that you want to leave our audience with today? What is something regarding sort of programming market systems in terms of why this approach is important, or what people can be doing? If people were to walk away with one thing today, what would your message to them be? Whoever's ready, just unmute, and we'd love to hear your closing thought for us today.
Yeah, I'll start. As the change wheel showed, there's a lot of moving parts in the housing market system, and it's often easy to know and to be explicit about what you're focusing on, but it's also just as important to be clear about what you aren't focusing on. And that's one of the learnings that we've had, and I think it's very important with more systemic programming to be explicit about what you're not going to focus on.
Thank you, Sheldon. Thank you for leaving us with that thought. What do you want to focus on? What don't you? Which part of the market system are you tackling at the moment that needs some kind of change, or different patterns of investment, or valued locally, and maybe shifting later to another area? Really useful closing thought. Jennifer, are you ready next?
Yeah, thanks. I think for me, and we're still kind of learning, that we're at the beginning of our journey on applying these approaches, but I think it really takes time, and also it takes a lot of attention to build awareness and encourage creative and different ways of thinking among our teams. And it may be like a different skill set and a different way of approaching problems than we might be used to, especially in the humanitarian sector, where we're used to kind of delivering on solutions and seeing immediate impact. And I think, you know, a key difference with working on kind of market systems approaches for housing is that it really requires a much longer term horizon and that kind of space to think differently, to try things out, to test approaches and to fail, like Sheldon and the others mentioned. So yeah, I think kind of adjusting our thinking and encouraging the same in our teams on the ground as well is really important.
Jennifer, Hema, over to you. Just a quick, short closing thought.
Implementing market systems is about ask ourselves the right questions so that we can bring on board many of us to it and have that understanding.
Great, thank you, Hema. Cecilia.
Well, I would say let us not take everything for granted. Take the moment to reflect, to go from practice to revision all the time, and be sure that we are exchanging with peers, that connections are solid among partners.
Thank you. Also, really good closing thoughts from the panel. Thank you so much. And thank you to your organizations for very, in many ways, spearheading some of these approaches in terms of bringing market development, systems thinking into this area around affordable and high quality housing. So thank you to everyone today. And we look forward to seeing where this programming develops and what some of the learning is as we move into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Margie.
everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Bye, guys.